Um, this is basically the structure that we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Gold Mountain, because that sets up the scene. But really the focus today is on San Diego Chinatown history. And we're going to take it to really about World War II, and then things change dramatically. That's a whole nother class. So the focus is on this is really about San Diego's Chinatown. I want to introduce a web walking tour of the Asian Pacific Historic District that you can do this on time. So you can see here, we'll cover the early years. So this is kind of a rough breakdown about how the Chinese and the Chinese American community in San Diego, different phases. And I say Chinese and Chinese American because there really is this shift between Chinese who were first here, wanting to have a better life for their families, but they were here as sojourners, to Chinese American families. And you'll see that change coming over time. So then there's persistence during the Chinese Exclusion era. Then there's a noticeable shift of Chinese to Chinese Americans, from exotic to citizen, World War II, and then Chinese American immigration. So I want to just do this slide just really quickly, just to give you some background, some new information. There's a historian, Erica Lee, who has pointed out that the Chinese in North America has actually been around for quite some time. Spain had conquered the Philippines, and so there was a galleon trade going from the Philippines or Manila, going up to the west coast of Mexico, Acapulco. They would transport goods across Mexico and then keep on sailing all the way over to Spain. So there's a long history, a big history of the Chinese in Acapulco, even going back as far as 1580. And then in the United States' early years, there really was this interest in China. So United States, new America, a new country, really didn't know for too much. It sent its first ship, the Empress China, from the East Coast. They sailed to China with, interestingly enough, the Spanish silver. So in this age, Spanish silver was a dominant world trade money, and ginseng from Pennsylvania. So they knew enough that China was interested in ginseng, and they needed, of course, to have things to trade. So they loaded up the Empress of China, and then traded back for tea, silks, and porcelains. In the 1800s, then the labor needs across the world were really high. So a lot of countries, a lot of colonies were banning the slave trade. So they needed workers. So remember, in this day and age, how things got done is you needed to have laborers. So a lot of the Chinese in the 1800s, conditions in China were very poor. There was war going on, natural disasters, famine, were pushing Chinese across really the whole world. So there is this amazing story about the Chinese diaspora, and we're now just going to be focusing on just our limited slice here in San Diego. So many of you have heard that gold was discovered in 1848. It took a year for the word to get out, and so in 1849, that's when the 49ers really flooded to California. However, you could see here that the Chinese, they were actually, the trade routes from China to San Francisco, though small, were already developed, and sometimes it was almost easier to get to California from Hong Kong. Hong Kong at that time was a new British colony. And so there was trade happening. The increase you can see from 1849 to 1852 really jumped quickly, up to 20,000 by 1852. And these were men, sojourners, who were here to basically, earn money so they could take it back to and support their families, because the conditions in China were so difficult. Just really briefly, they were here for the mining because that was what the stories were. But most did not find gold. Some did, and but the great majority found quite a bit of a hostility. So there was the mining in this time. So this is again, let's say 1850s, 1860s. At this time, I want to set it up that California was a very new state. So so it had just become a state in 1850, and just a couple of years earlier, or had been won by the United States. So it was very much of a Wild West. And so if somebody stake out a claim, they could easily be pushed out by more powerful forces. So they ended up getting pushed out. So they went into supporting services like cooking and laundry. And this was throughout the West. There was timber industries, fishing. They got into really whatever they needed to do. I talked about last session the Transcontinental Railroad, the Central Pacific, going from Sacramento, Utah. That was completed in 1869. And then the fishing industry in Monterey, that was a prime place where the Chinese could actually earn a good living because they were filling in an unfilled niche at that point. And then agriculture. And so amidst this, there were some successes, but they ended up oftentimes retreating to urban Chinatowns and working in service jobs and factories. So let's get down to then the San Diego Chinese. And these are the main subjects. They're fishing, railroad construction, farming, and I'll cover those, each of these topics. So fishing was actually started in the 1860s. I saw one entry from 1850. There was one Chinese man in San Diego at the time, according to the 1850s, but there's no other information really available. In the 1860s, the Chinese were looking for ways to make a living and earn money. The point here about there's reputable sources that said that these coastal junks were built here in San Diego. Now this is where the historical mind, you think, all right, so they had redwood lumber that they needed to transport down to San Diego, and then you needed to have somebody who knew how to build a junk. So that particular statement, I really want to find the primary sources that say, how they felt that redwood coastal junks were built here in San Diego. So I'm going with, were built here in California and sailed down. Abalone was abundant, and there were, let's see, according to 1 year, 5 tons of abalone was fished around the San Diego and the Baja area. It was put on then a ship that was transported that up to San Francisco, and then from there, that's where abalone dried was sent back to China or consumed in the larger Chinatown of San Francisco. So many of us are familiar with, of course, San Francisco being a really very interesting, Chinatown and the dominant port for the Chinese. So you can see here that in 1870, though, there were very few Chinese, but San Diego itself was a very small town, only 2,300. So this is something that, that's easy to forget. San Diego, we hear of Alonzo Horton starting up San Diego around the early 1870s. But in the 1850s, a man named William Heath Davis tried to set up San Diego's downtown in Newtown, and unfortunately, the economy was such that he was not successful. So Alonzo Horton is considered the founder of San Diego's Newtown, but it was still very small at this time. Now, here was something that was significant. There was a law called the Scott Act that really affected the Chinese because it demanded that Chinese would not be allowed to return. So if you're a fisherman, that if you left San Diego to go fishing somewhere, then you had a legal hurdle in order to get back. So that, as well as other discriminatory laws, really forced the Chinese to abandon fishing because of the hostility at the time. So the 1800s is very significant. So the photo on the right that you see here, that's actually, well, both of these photos are junks moored here in San Diego Harbor. So according to this map, so this is a Sanborn map of, basically it's an insurance map, but it was created in 1887. And you can see here that there's and can you see my mouse moving around on the blocks by the number 3? So right here is where parts of Chinatown were. There would have been small fishing shacks along the waterfront. And if you go to the museum, or when the museum is open, there's a wonderful model that shows the Chinese fishing industry. And then there's a wharf that juts out along Fifth Avenue. So this would be typically where the ships would dock at the wharf, and then they would enter in and go up Fifth Avenue. So this area was still considered the undesirable area. So there were other parts along D Street, which is now Broadway, that were considered the better parts of San Diego Newtown. So there's the fishing industry. This photo here, and again, I take a lot of my knowledge and give credit to somebody who I call the Dean of San Diego Chinese American History, Murray Lee. So he was the one who has written an outstanding book about the San Diego Chinese. That's actually our textbook for the volunteer program and for the DOSA program. And so this photo is captured, and a lot of this information is from his work. So I want to really credit Murray for being so knowledgeable. So you can see here that railroads then helped really power the growth of San Diego. So the key person, Quinn, who we'll talk about a little bit later, in 1880, he comes down here, and he's hired to find and support and lead Chinese work crews for the California Southern Railroad. So from National City through San Diego, going up the coast, then heading up to Fallbrook and up to Temecula. So that was the first line that connected San Diego to the Transcontinental Railroad in the early 1880s. And that really produced a tremendous boom for San Diego. So we hear lots of talk about the Hotel Dell. Well, the Hotel Dell was built because the Transcontinental Railroad just brought in a flood of people, and unfortunately, that railroad line ended up washing out a few years later. So they had to, the railroad had to build in an alternate route, which is then coming down from Los Angeles. And that's one of the reasons then why is that all the rail was coming through Los Angeles. Los Angeles ended up, really dominating the transcontinental trade. And San Diego, while it had its little claim and a burst of fame, then faded off into a little spur. But the Chinese really then, I feel comfortable in making the argument that the Chinese were really pivotal in building the railroad that led to San Diego's first great boom. Then this photo here down at the bottom. So if you see here, it's a street photo, and And it shows a wooden building. So this would be the type of housing that was in the less desirable part of San Diego. So just a very simple building, doors facing out to the street, and this is where the Chinese laborers would live as frugally as possible, because they really wanted to send their money back to China. They're be looking for work. So this is where the laundry aspect worked out. So the museum has traditionally had some great exhibits about Chinese laundries. It was, again, not a traditional skill, but it was an underserved niche. And just as importantly, which a little bit later, it qualifies you as running a business, so you could be a merchant, and that allowed you to stay here in San Diego. And then there was low capital needs to start up a laundry. Brutally tough work, though. And but it was a successful niche for the Chinese. And then they could be servants. So a lot of San Diego families like to hire Chinese servants, because they were industrious and reliable, and so many Chinese families would choose to hire a Chinese cook specifically. This actually proved to be very useful, because the families would want to have American food, not Chinese food. So this is where these Chinese servants got their training in terms of cooking, which would then later become useful when they needed to go into the restaurant business. So the Marston family, you can see here, they had hired the Chinese cooks. Want to get into market farming. So these were sojourners from southern China, and they were already good at farming. So they went into market farming. Sometimes there were limitations on what they could lease and control in terms of land, but they would be called truck farmers, not because they sold it out of a truck. The term is truck farming, is that if you had a farmland, then you would actually turn out to put it on a truck, but my understanding, it's based on a French word. And so Chula Vista was a big location where farming took place, and as well as Mission Valley. So again, this is the 1870s, 1880s. Mission Valley was just undeveloped and a very rich place for farming. And then the Chinese Congregational Mission Society formed. So this, again, these were white Christian, let's say Presbyterian organizations and churches, and they wanted to convert the Chinese. So during this time period, then they form a society to help Christianize and educate the Chinese. So that happens during this period. I do want to highlight a couple of things. So this repeats a bit of what I covered in session 1, but I do need to just remind folks that in 1871, there was a massive massacre of the Chinese that started with some infighting among the Chinese Teutons. However, what ended up happening is that after word got out, these mobs ended up gathering, and by that evening, they had lynched and massacred 18 Chinese. And so that was actually a terrible incident that really doesn't get much play. And then the Rock Springs, Wyoming massacre, where miners were surrounded and driven out. So here's the line, the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, very significant. You can see here the language: Chinese laborers to the United States shall be suspended. And then future legislation made that permanent. So this is the first law that targeted a nationality. So I want to talk about in the 1800s. So following the boom, San Diego Chinese, this is the largest the society had. And actually, I remember this number from Judith Liu's thesis, where she identified through the census that there were 909 Chinese in the 1890 census, and alluded to, because of the boom, it was actually larger a few years earlier, but the evidence, unfortunately, we don't have the hard numbers. So the Chinese society was actually very large here. And we would have had then some secret societies that were similar and outgrowths of societies from China. So they, because this is now a male-dominated Wild West town, there were, I guess, bad things happening. So not only was there lottery, well, I should say there was opium drug trading, because the Chinese were many of them were dependent on the opium drug. And the opium story is, of course, a completely separate issue that Chinese tried to fight against it in the 1840s, lost, but it was still basically part of the San Diego Chinatown. This was then the largest that San Diego's Chinatown was. Lottery and gambling, well, I have to say, gambling in Chinese culture, even though it was a not officially approved by the Chinese government, according to my Chinese historian that served on my thesis committee. Gambling was a tremendous recreational activity for the Chinese, even today. So how it's viewed in terms of United States viewing gambling and the lottery is different than how the Chinese would view lottery. And in fact, even the lottery was somewhat popular with the San Diegans here. So there's stories about lottery tickets. They would be sold in stores, or people would go around and sell lottery tickets to the general population, and that was actually part of the pastime in this. So it's not necessarily the dirty, seedy aspect of gambling. And then unfortunately, there is a bit of prostitution. So because San Diego's Chinese population was relatively large at this time, there was an incident where the Marston family, there was a woman who she was unfortunately here as part of, I consider, the slave trade, because these women are not here voluntarily. They were either tricked or brought here involuntarily, and then they served as in the prostitution within the Chinese communities along the west, and then a little bit here in San Diego. Here's a case where the Marston family actually helped rescue one of those women. And then I'm talking about, there's brief references to a association called the Lu Bing Company that was formed to protect merchants at the time against one of the societies, the Chi Kung Tung, in 1888. So that's some of that dark side. So here's then the general perception of the Chinese in San Diego was they are still considered, sub-inferior. So here's a quote that I think really details it. You can see here, a pigtailed and quilted celestial was astride a bicycle and staring down the street in sublime indifference to cheers or sneers. He was Quan Main Qi, a Chinese merchant. So Quan Main, the reason why I highlight him during this part is that he was a recent immigrant here to San Diego, but became really highly successful after the 1910s. But it shows that they called the Q, which in China, very much of a sign of respect to the emperor, but it was really looked down upon here. And the quilted celestial would have referred to the quilted wear that was typical at the time. But celestial is also considered a racial slur, not as bad as some of the worst ones, but it was basically saying, okay, you're celestial, and that was a way of looking down upon the Chinese, even though the Chinese, within the Chinese language, refer to themselves as celestials. But in this particular society, this was considered a minor slur. And so merchant ownership was one of the ways to survive, and was a success early. Here's somebody that we really honor as being one of our earliest leaders. So Aquin, because he had worked on the railroad, then he was really one of the first families and successes here in San Diego. So this is now like the late 1890s. The Exclusion Act is beginning to, suppress the growth, and San Diego's Chinatown is shrinking. However, Quan Main was was unusual. So he was Christian. He had 12 children. He started off with that Oriental goods store because he could then supply the railroad crews that were building the railroad tracks. And then, of course, he was unique because he had that Christian education. He could read and write English. So one of his claims to fame is that he wrote some diaries that are located at the San Diego History Center. And there's been some great academic work of analyzing his writings. There is a book from a Cal State San Marcos faculty who's she's going to be releasing it, published by Stanford University. And so one argument could mean that he was one of the first, if not the first, Chinese American literature writers of the time. He was a very successful businessman. He ran a restaurant, and then he would use then the legal system because he was hired oftentimes as an interpreter. So he was considered a leader of San Diego's Chinatown from, let's say, the 1890s until his death in 1914. So he actually sued a newspaper for slander, and knew how to use the court system at the time. And then there's a note here that he also worked with the San Diego general community as a Chinatown leader when San Diego wished to improve the sanitation that was still pretty poor along the waterfront and in Chinatown. So this part here, you can see that the numbers really start to decline. So in 20 years, the Chinese population falls by 2/3, but then the city of San Diego grows tremendously to 39,000 by 1910. So this is going to get into where my thesis actually brought me to. And so my thesis was Chinese representation in San Diego's 1915 and 1935 expositions in Balboa Park. So I really appreciated being able to work on this topic because it combined my two loves of the Chinese American community with Balboa Park. And so I'll be able to answer, of course, a lot of questions about this time period, but there really isn't a whole lot written. So that was also something that I really appreciated, being able to add to the knowledge of San Diego during this time. So the Chinese were no longer so much of a threat because the numbers were down. San Diego was growing, and yet a few Chinese American families began to grow. But overall, it was basically a very small Chinatown. Now, if you compare that with Los Angeles and then San Francisco, and even little places, little towns throughout the West, mining towns, the Chinatowns were actually quite a bit larger. In the Central Valley, Stockton, Sacramento, Boise, these were all towns that, Boise, Idaho, had much larger Chinatowns during this era. There was support during this time with the Chi Kung Tung about the revolution of the Chinese Republic. So Dr. Sun Yat-sen was the first president. And then so you can see here, there's some statistics about a few boys and girls, 32 boys and 10 girls were listed in the 1920 census. Now, what I'm particularly excited about, I'll cover the stingaree. So before the 1915 Exposition in Balboa Park, the stingaree and Chinatown were kind of viewed as being the same, but they really weren't. But this was basically the cheap part of town. So by the stingaree, I refer to this being the saloon and the prostitution and the gambling district of San Diego, where the police would prefer to kind of keep this unsavory activity in a location that they could keep an eye on. And then it's because it's the rundown part of town, Chinatown still existed. So you can see here that there's a mixture of stores of Chinese. So the Wu Chi Chong grocery store is down here on 3rd Avenue. And I'm going to move my mouse around it right here. You can see right next to it, there's a saloon called the Old Tub of Blood. And then right where the Horton Grand Hotel is on 3rd Avenue and Island, there's another saloon called 7 Buckets of Blood. You can see here that there's Quinn with his 12 kids lived here, and then those more saloons. And then remember that photo where it was that 1-story building with cribs? So that was all along, here and here. They just had, very simple buildings where the Chinese could live. And so I want to kind of distinguish between, even though they called it the stingaree in Chinatown, that, let's say for the prostitution, because I believe that because the Chinese community had gotten so much smaller, that the, let's say the prostitution, problem was now, San Diego is now quite a bit larger. The prostitution was catering to the general population. And at this point, I'm not able to find any evidence of Chinese prostitution happening in San Diego during this time. But the whole area is viewed as really being, this is the sordid and unsavory place of San Diego. So here's an example of how they looked upon the Chinese during the opium. So again, opium was used. And so here's an article in one of the newspapers when they attempted to clean out the opium dens. Pretty demeaning caricatures, made up Chinese characters that they're talking in Chinese. Take one more smell is what the caption is saying. So there were 2 efforts. One was a drug-based effort by a man named Fred Bowden from the Board of Pharmacy, and then Walter Bellin was hired by the city of San Diego to be a sanitation engineer, but he was also health inspector. And this whole effort was part of the progressive era in the United States, where people wanted things, people realized that in the late 1800s, capitalism had kind of run amok, and certain health issues or changes needed to happen. So early 1900s, this is an era where, women still could not vote. So that was one of the efforts that said, okay, we need to be treating everyone more fairly. But also there was the effort of improving sanitation. So I stumbled upon this as doing my research and became basically the crux of my thesis. So here you can see there's this attraction called Underground Chinatown. So at that point, you can imagine San Diego had a big city park, and it wanted to have an exposition to honor the opening of the Panama Canal. So San Diego put in a bid, San Francisco put in a bid, New Orleans put in a bid for a World's Fair to celebrate this. And San Diego, San Francisco then agreed, okay, we will work together. There were some difficult conversations and discussions and negotiations and back and forth. And in the end, San Diego almost lost its opportunity to have an exposition because San Francisco, a much larger city It was the western port for the United States. It won the right to have the Panama Pacific International Exposition. So I say that specifically because you can see here in 1915, we were only able to have a regional exposition called the California Panama Exposition because we needed to be more limited. But San Diego, still a small city, was very plucky, and it created its main California Tower and the plazas and the streets that have the Spanish colonial look. That's the look of the 1915 Exposition, when all those buildings went up, most of them temporary. And then there was a fun zone. So similar to the county fairs that we have now here, there was a fun zone area that was really more completely entertainment driven. And an outside developer came in, created this attraction. You can see here these pagodas, a ticket gate here that would charge 10 cents for admission. And really it was geared towards insulting the Chinese, but it was still kind of, hey, you know, I can go into a place and go slumming a bit. So you would enter this attraction, and they had wax figures representing the opium den, a Chinese slave prostitute, gambling, and you were in this kind of subterraneous, mysterious maze of vice. And this is what they sold admission to. And it was, you know, unfortunately, very profitable at the time. This image here is from a newspaper that shows a vaudeville actor named Art Phillips dressed up in yellow face. So still, you know, in this demeaning fashion, he's dressed up like an Asian, he's squatting, and he's next to two, you know, very charming women. So really it's, you know, it's still, the Chinese were still viewed as being inferior at this time. Now, thankfully, there was enough pressure that the exposition leaders realized that this Chinatown attraction was still pretty insulting. So they came out with this book in 1915. And you can see here the text says, "This is not a fair representation of the Chinese people in America. It is an interesting representation by wax figures of habits and practices once in vogue in a well-known coast city." So they're not even saying this was, you know, San Francisco or San Diego. While a good show for the money, one's natural thought is that thankfulness for what it represents has largely passed away. So interestingly enough, San Francisco had a similar attraction. There was the Chinese consulate and the Chinese community protested enough so that it got shut down, and it got named Underground Slumming up in San Francisco. San Diego, much smaller Chinese community, Chinese consulate still objected. A year later, this attraction got named Underground World. So I want to highlight that we remember, well, we know about the Japanese Friendship Garden in Balboa Park. So behind the botanical building, there was actually a lovely Japanese tea garden that was run by, you know, a Japanese family that served tea. And so the Japanese were treated much better at this time because Japan was a world power during this time. So Japan had defeated China, was the first Asian power to defeat a white nation, or the Western nation. So Japan had the political heft to basically be treated more respectfully. And unfortunately, China was still a young but weak republic at this time. So I want to highlight here another slide. This is where China was able to participate. So the big plaque, that's one of our wonderful additions at the Chinese Museum, represents the Chinese Commercial Commission that visited San Diego. The thing that I think is really important is that the stress here was the friendship. So you can see the American flag and then the early Chinese Republic flag representing the 5 bands of China. So this was the Republic of China flag early on from 1912 until 1928. And Um, in terms of representation, the Liberty Bell represents the United States. This bronze vessel is also a revered Chinese symbol. So really they were trying to say, you know, we are, you know, partners, we're a young republic, and we want to be friends. In spite of having a insulting Chinatown attraction in the fun zone. Here is a map of the Exposition 1915. So you can see here, and if you can follow my mouse, there is the main street, Calle de Prado, Plaza de Panama. So this is named after, of course, Panama opening. So the main plaza that we're very familiar with. And then the California Tower, one of the iconic scenes, is right here. And then here's the Cabrillo Bridge. So then you come over here, and basically the fun zone was where the parking lot of the San Diego Zoo is. So you see it stretched on quite a bit. And at that point, the animals in the zoo were over on here by this display here called the, let's see, this, oh boy. And it was an Indian village, something in the Southwest. And so let's see. So you can see here that then the zoo would eventually move to a different location over the years. So I wanted to say now this quiet period after the Exposition, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association then formed, and it had been, you know, the dominant organization representing the Chinese really across the whole United States since its founding in 1882. Now, if you're familiar a bit, then before that there was an association called the Six Companies that represented the Chinese as early as the 1850s. So many Chinese were coming in, so kind of shifting your mind back, that they needed to have an organization that could speak for, and in some ways try to protect the Chinese sojourners who were here. They, you know, they did mutual aid, employment, but the Six Companies, because China has so many different dialects, that's where the associations, you know, came from. So CCBA then really got organized officially in 1882 in response to the hostility around the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then it formed the San Diego branch in 1921. There is some evidence. Some folks say that they formed here sooner, so there may have been activity. However, according to the national records I've been able to find from, you know, one of the main Chinese American historians, Him Mark Lai, the San Diego branch formed in 1921. Now, out of this building here that you're looking at, then another organization called the Chinese American Citizens Alliance was formed. Now, originally this was called Native Sons of the Golden State, which was built on another group. Oh gosh, now Native Sons of the Golden. It was a different organization that was really kind of a nativist association. The Chinese saw that this particular organization was particularly powerful, so Chinese Americans then formed their own organization called Native Sons of the Golden State. It needed to then change its name to Chinese American Citizens Alliance because there was interest among Chinese Americans all through the United States to have an organization for them, so they changed their name. But it was both a mutual support organization as well as an immigration civil rights, so they even got involved in some politics. So there's a case where there was a senator who the San Diego CACA came out against his reelection because he had supported some immigration laws that restricted wives of American citizens from coming to the United States. So they were interviewed by the newspapers, and so they were active. That particular branch, you know, shut down at some point afterwards. So there is a Chinese American Citizens Alliance nationally, as well as up in Los Angeles. So this building here, so there was the Association Qikong Tong. They built this building in 1911. CCBA has this as one of their historical photos. So it's really one of the only historical photos around. I'm thankful to CCBA for sharing this. But this photo here shows a celebration of the Double 10. The Double 10 is an important date in Chinese history because it signals the start of the revolution towards the Republic of China. And so Double 10 is significant. So with that, I'm going to stop and then take a short break. However, are there any questions right now that I could, answer based on the information that you've seen? And I'm going to get back on. So, hello, hi. Any questions that you might have? I'm looking through the chat. Okay. And so let's see. So how about this is I'm going to go offline for a little bit, just for about 5 minutes. So what I would encourage you, stand up and kind of stretch your legs. I'm going to flip over and make sure that I can bring up a couple of web pages that will add to this, this presentation. So.
That's interesting.
Michael?
Yes.
Michael, Mary Jo Hausman here, and this is a mechanical issue, but I couldn't get it into the chat. Forgive this interruption. At the break, would you please, at the break, would you please restore the maps and the slides to me? Thank you so much.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
For those, I can see a handful of people. Are you able to see the slides? And let's say, Bob, I see that you're on.
Michael, this is Lucy Wong. This is Lucy Wong. I can see your slides.
Good. All right. Okay. So
I think it's just Michael.
okay. Louis, would you be able to see if you can address Mary Jo's issue?
On the slides?
On the slides, yes.
I can send the presentation after the meeting to everyone who registered.
All right.
So if you have not registered for the meeting, please go to the museum website, the event page, and register for this event.
Michael,
Right.
I think she might need to click on something. Sometimes you have to click on something to get the slides to pop up.
Okay. Yeah.
Play around.
Okay.
If you go to the bottom right of your screen, putting your cursor at the bottom, there are 3 little dots.
Yeah.
If you click on those 3 little dots, you can change layout. And you can choose sidebar. That will move all of the photos to the right, and it will bring up the presentation in the big box.
Okay.
Yeah, the cursor at the bottom of the screen, you have to sort of move the cursor to make sure that you see all the choices there, and it's the little tiny dot to the right.
I think we need to take a break. Michael Yee, do you know, this is Lucy, do you know Dr. at the Palomar College?
I'm sorry, I missed that. Who at Palomar College?
Dr. Dr. Shi, S-H-I? Dalao Shi.
I do not.
Okay. He's the one, I learned a lot about Chinese civilization and history when I was living there in San Marcos area. I didn't know if she's still there.
Okay. All right. I will keep an ear out for.
I would thought she would have been on your Zoom today. Someone like her. I thought she lives in Rancho Bernardo.
Okay, I see.
The last I didn't know. And tell Marie Lee I said hello too.
Okay.
I've known Marie for a long time.
I'm glad you mentioned his name. Yes, I've known him for a very long time, and he's a lot. You know, he still kind of stays plugged in, but he has really scaled back his work, and so yes, I wish him well as well.
Yeah, his health is diminishing.
All right, I will be right back. Hold on.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, I am back. So, how are you all doing? Anybody, wish to make a comment, and we can get a little bit back to the show on the road?
I thought it was a good lecture.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I can't see your name down at the bottom of my screen, but good seeing you again. And
Yeah, thank you.
thank you for the feedback. So I'm going to what I'm going to do is I will present, and while people return, I'm going to flip between some different windows. And if you could, somebody give me a verbal if switching is working. So I'm going to do this.
Michael, it's Robin Bragman. We see you well. We can see you fine. And
Cool.
and thank you for your wonderful presentation. I'm enjoying it.
Thank you. All right.
And your screen is now presenting as well.
Okay, so I have brought up a tab that says Asia Pacific Historic District. Is that showing up?
Michael, could I ask you a question?
Yes, actually, you know what? Could I confirm? Are you seeing an Asian Pacific Historic District?
Yeah.
Okay, and then I'm going to flip over here, mapping inequality.
Yeah, U.S. map.
Great.
Michael,
Yeah.
Mary
All
Jo
right.
Hausman, yes, I got him.
Terrific.
Thank you.
All right.
1988.
Okay.
So, Michael, from 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, in 1988, they formed that, what do you call it? protection agency. So they were so threatened. They had to come together in 1888, right?
1880. Well, I guess 1882 would be really a pivotal year.
Yeah, they were in deep doo-doo right there. And then 1988 in San Diego, they had formed that thing against the Chinese back then, 6 years later after the Exclusion Act was passed. I thought that was it was one of your slides.
Okay. All right. Well,
It was after that 1882, after that stupid law was passed.
yes, I know. Interestingly, that was, so that allowed, you didn't see the text, but it allowed a few small groups, merchants, students, representatives of the government to visit. But really, I mean, it was targeted at keeping the Chinese out.
Yeah, only the people like in current times, like Melania Trump, she made a big deal, in my opinion, because I can't relate to her very much being a typical immigrant because she had the more privileged background.
Okay, I'm sorry, who was the person you're talking about?
Oh, our first lady. It's like the ones that you're talking about in 1882 were the more privileged Chinese that got to come here, like engineers, skilled workers, professors, and they kept that the laborers at the time, the ones that did all the hard work.
Right. Okay.
So it's like Melania Trump talking this week about the immigrants, how she came here, which sounded a lot of BS to me. She didn't represent to me the typical immigrants that come here, like my parents. They went through. Anyway, that's another topic.
Okay. Well, cool. I mean, I'll be happy to chat with you more about that. Okay. So what I wanted to do is, so now what we're painting the picture, it's, let's say, about in the 1920s, San Diego, Chinatown is still, is still pretty small, but some of these organizations are getting established, and there's a handful of Chinese families that are now in San Diego. As part of then that effort, so in order to address both the laborers who are here and the wish to Christianize China, so they basically viewed this as a missionary effort. So this is why it was called the Chinese Mission. A Protestant the Congregational Church formed a number of different educational services, missions, and then this particular building that the Chinese Museum was grateful to be able to use is an early photo of the mission built on First Avenue. So basically, this is where Ralph's grocery store is. So you can see here along the back, then there's a two-story dormitory where they could live, workers could live, but then it was English classes, church services, and their hope was that these would go back to China and convert more Chinese. San Diego leaders were actually very supportive. So George Marston, one of our early San Diego leaders, he donated the land and supported a lot of the activities to fundraise for this particular building. So there were different associations. The Chinese Association, the Chunghwa Language School had their, so this would be for children. Now there's a growing number of children. And I pulled that thought for a bit. And then later on, you can see Boy Scout troops, Cub Scout troops were being formed. So families were beginning to grow here in San Diego. During this period, I like to point out that the Chinese businesses were getting stronger. So here's two ads that highlight two aspects. One is that this was the ad on the left. You can see here, the Nanking Cafe was open between 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. for late night dining. So I thought this is a completely fascinating thing because, on one hand, Chinese was still viewed as being this exotic culture, still somewhat inferior. However, it was a great place to go for entertainment. So the Nanking Cafe called themselves the bright spot of Chinatown. Now, it was also pointed out to me that Nanking Cafe was very significant because this showed that the San Diego Chinese at this time were still very supportive of the nationalist party in China, because Nanking had been as the capital of China in 1927. So here was very clearly a political statement that was, geared towards the Chinese and the people of the time. Now, interestingly, if you think about how Chinese restaurants are named now, they have, the Golden Lion, the Imperial Mandarin, these are all names, Panda Inn, things like that. So naming of restaurants is very significant. Chinatown was close to the theater district in San Diego, so that would be a place that people could go for entertainment. The interesting thing about the ad on the right-hand side that features chop suey is, so chop suey, the idea is that chop suey was an American adaptation of Chinese dishes, and that chop suey did not exist in China. So some food historians have researched that, and so that story is kind of true. There's a dish called chop suey that is a recipe in southern China. That chop suey means mixed bits, but the story about chop suey has two legends. One is that there was a imperial representative in New York in the late 1800s who visited, and he visited Chinatown, and he liked what he ate there. So reporters asked the Chinese restaurant, well, what did he eat? And so the response was chop suey. So chop suey became a very famous and well-known dish in America, but really not really well known in China. The other story is that in the West, hungry miners went into a Chinese restaurant, and the cook had run out of food. So he just whipped up something, whatever he had, again, mixed bits, and came up with a dish. They asked what it was, they liked it, and he replied chop suey. So there's a couple of legends that go around chop suey. But basically, chop suey was the intriguing Chinese food of the time, the early 1900s. You can see how they have a Chinese woman, very elegant, still kind of mysterious. And so this was the look and feel of how the Chinese merchants advertised to the general population and how they survived. So a lot of then, in terms of restaurants, the skill for cooking came from when they were being servants in Western and San Diego households. Another major part of San Diego's Chinese history is Wu Chi Chang. So I remember going down to downtown, basically old Chinatown, and my father would drop my grandmother off at that CCBA building. There was a Chinese Seniors Club there, so she could socialize. And we'd go to the library, and then we'd go shopping at the Wu Chi Chang over on 16th Street. This particular photo represents is a model that is in the Chinese Museum now, so you can see it when we reopen. And it represents Wu Chi Chang on 3rd Avenue in the early 1900s. So you can see the two doors in the back of this image is the front facing the street. There were then Chinese goods, fine goods in the front of the store, and then behind where this image were the foodstuffs and things. So this particular layout, we have a model maker. Her name is Lois Whitmer, and she interviewed the owners of Wu Chi Chang to get this particular layout. So, I need to spend more time on this because I think it's very important. The ad on the right-hand side shows the different products that they were offering from China, including, so Wu Chi-chang was, very savvy. In this particular case, this is kind of like a Christmas ad that they placed in the newspaper. So you can see that they're catering to the general population for products from China. And then I have many good memories of actually going to the Wu Chi-chang in Kearny Mesa before they closed in the mid-1990s. So this photo here represents the growing Chinese community. You can see the two flags. So there, and this is so the American flag, the old Chinese Republic flag, and it's the Chinese Congregational mission in, let's see, 1925. And you can see now there's a mixture of the adults and the children. So this is now where families are being able to grow, and then the children being born here in the United States are now American citizens. So this is also a time when, a lot of the Chinese, so the perceptions will change that we're now Chinese Americans. So if you were born in China, you're now living here in the United States, you're building a family, and your allegiance is growing more toward being a Chinese American. The perceptions of China are improving quite a bit. So Pearl Buck wrote a very popular novel, Good Earth, about rural Chinese, still kind of stereotyped, but it really produced a lot of positive perceptions towards the Chinese. And then the Japanese were really being aggressive. They took over a northern territory of China, Manchuria, named it Manchukuo. And so there was more and more sympathy going on towards the Chinese. And then at the 1935 Exposition, the Hall of China opens. I have a few more slides, so I'll talk about that later. We still should remember that they were still segregated here in Chinatown, and but the families were growing and they were going to school. Some of them were going to college. However, it was repeatedly noted that a lot of them, even with a college education, still could not find jobs that were appropriate for their education. So I like to show this photo because here's actually the store Quan Main. So earlier I introduced a merchant named Quan Main. So now he's actually out here. I do not believe Quan Main is in this photo. This is not something that's well documented, but you can see here on Fifth Avenue, he sells Chinese and Japanese fancy goods. So they're becoming increasingly more Americanized. They have the Western suits, and it was an elegant place to go shopping. So here was one, and Quan Main actually ended up opening stores in La Jolla and Coronado. So he was so successful that he was able to really cater to the upscale Asian goods market. Then on the right-hand side, we see here a picture from the yearbook, and the vice president of the Sergeants Club, basically ROTC, let's see, Albert Quan, so related to the Quan Main, he's vice president of this club. So it's showing that, thankfully there is growing acceptance of these Chinese Americans here. So I wanted to highlight this because unlike the 1915 Exposition, the organizers actually came to CCBA and asked for their participation. So CCBA was able to, set up a couple of organizations. One was a organizing exhibition committee. Another one was the Hall of China. So if you're familiar with Balboa Park, they have the international cottages. Well, so in this case, CCBA set up the Hall of China. It's now called the House of China. and they were able to decorate and represent China in the way that they wished. It was not pushed onto them. And so, you know, to me, this is a very significant shift from even just 20 years earlier, where the Chinese were able to represent themselves, you know, honorably and proudly as both American and Chinese. So the program that you see here, I'm grateful to David said at the House of China, he shared this program. You can see here that they started out at the Organ Pavilion and then had opening remarks, combination of Chinese and American performers. There was a big parade that went from Chinatown, right in front of the Chinese Consolidated CCBA building, went up 6th Avenue, crossed the bridge, and then they had another set of performances at the Organ Pavilion. So this was basically now China Day, heavily involved by the Chinese, and they were treated as, you know, as full representatives of participating in the exposition. The international cottages also had other countries that hosted their own cottage. So there was the Hall of England, the Irish Free State. So, and then, but also, unfortunately, well, it was good at the time. Japan and Germany were represented. That international cottages was officially called the House of Pacific Relations, with Pacific being intended to mean this is directed towards peace. Now, unfortunately, a few years later, you know, Japan and Germany would be really full-scale, you know, warfare, and so this particular effort at international peace did not succeed. The thing that I find really interesting about the House of Pacific Relations is that in their bylaws, they say that members must be good citizens. Now, so remember, the Chinese Exclusion Act, one of its impacts is that it did not allow citizens if you were Chinese. So most of the members at this point involved were born in China. So there's I think an interesting story yet to be told of how much did the House of Pacific Relations leadership overlook the fact that they're working with Chinese members of the community and they were technically not citizens. I think there's some good promise there. So here's a map of how the Chinese were involved in the 1935 exposition. So you can see here, so it's now, the orientation is different. Up and down is the Calle de Prado, the California Tower, and in blue, you can see Chinese businesses actually were strong enough so that they could have exhibits in the main exhibition halls. So you can see here Quan Main, Chekian, Chinese Goods, K.H. Chow. He was a businessman from Chicago, and so they were able to have exhibitions and stores. Quan Main had a store in Spanish Village. So Spanish Village was created as part of the 1935 exposition. There was a Roads of the Pacific where you could drive on roads. So they pulled in some symbolized roads. And this is behind the Air and Space Museum. This whole wing here, as part of the 1935 exposition, was built just in a matter of a few months, from like January until Memorial Day of 1935. San Diego, you know, said, okay, we need to have a big exposition to try to get us out of the Great Depression. So these buildings were built with New Deal money. The Ford building, the round building, now home to, and I'm moving my mouse around it, is the Air and Space Museum. But this whole plaza came from the 1935 exposition. And you can see here the Hall of China. These clusters of international cottages were built during the same time. So I am going to try switching over to a different screen. And can somebody give me feedback if you're seeing mapping inequality, map of the US?
Yes.
Cool, thank you. All right. So this is a great example. I'm real. I didn't want to do that. Oh, you're killing me here. All right. Oh, here we go. United States. All right. So the thing that I find fascinating about this, so one of the emphasis of the history program at Cal State San Marcos is an emphasis on digital history. So it uses digital tools to convey or analyze or educate, provide educational methods towards history or humanities in general. So the reason I like this is because this is a very interactive. So this is an aspect of digital history. So I'm going to zoom in to San Diego. All right. Now, so you can see here, so this helps give us a definition of the term, well, redlining. So according to this map, and again, I'm using this as affecting the Chinese. So you can see here, San Diego Harbor, Coronado, Balboa Park is this white space, and I'm using the mouse. Downtown is right here. And then further north along here, there's a river. So that's Mission Valley. So it's fascinating. 1940, there was very little to the north. Mission Bay, also had called, previously called False Bay, is right here. And then this little insert here is La Jolla. So it's actually right here. So you can see here, as part of the New Deal programs, the federal government wanted to get housing loans out to people. So the Home Loan Corporation was formed, and unfortunately, it was only geared towards white consumers. And so they say, okay, where are places that you can live that are safe? So you have green areas that are the best. And so you see Point Loma, that was the wealthy part of town. B is blue, lots of pockets of B. And then yellow is concerning. So interestingly enough, places like Hillcrest and North Park are in 1940 identified as definitely declining. And then redlining is now these red areas. So this would be during this time period, the Chinese as well as African American, Mexican were able to move into different parts of San Diego. I like to highlight, although this is a sad state of affairs, so La Jolla is right up here in the inset, and I'm moving the mouse, and there was one little spot where the servants were allowed to live in La Jolla. So that's the little red line. Okay. Okay, so here I'm now back at the slides. This is the description of the area of in Southeast San Diego, or kind of heading towards National City. It's the north portion is occupied by mixed races, colored, Mexican, lower salaried white race laborers, and racial concentration of colored fraternity. So, unfortunately, this is the federal government's still description of the neighborhood, and still a lot of discrimination happening, even though there was some improvement in other areas. So we switched over to World War II, and this is where now there's more Chinese Americans that are showing their loyalty, and China is an ally against Japan, along with the United States. So there's dramatic changes here in Chinatown because of that. Job discrimination is reduced because there's a need for war labor. So we've heard stories about women being able to join the war, the employment force, because men were being sent off to war, and but different minorities were also able to enter in job fields that previously had been unavailable to them. So in the middle of the war, the Magnuson Act repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act and allowed Chinese to come to the United States, also allowed them to become citizens, but the quota was still only 105 at that time, so still very limited. So I like to see this photo because this represents, maybe where the Chinese American community really stepped up. So here's a troop, a photo taken from China of San Diego Chinese Americans working in the Army Air Corps. I like to note that Jennings Hom, he's the man here at the top. He supplied this photo. We have a wonderful book at the museum, Chinese American Veterans, that this is from. And his family, and he was a leader and the owner of Wujichang for many years. So you can see here that, he graduated from San Diego High School, and the Flying Tigers period that we are, aware of, where American pilots then flew in China fighting the Japanese and working with the Chinese. This was, this was an earlier time period, but it's kind of it's a significant, element in U.S. and China relations. So I wanted to at least form that connection between the two. And General Chiang Kai-shek, head of the Nationalist Party, was a strong ally of the United States. So he actually asked for Chinese Americans to serve in China so they could help, connect the military forces in China fighting the Japanese. Another person I like to highlight is Gorman Fong. So he was born in China, and he served in the Battle of the Bulge in the European theater. So I think that the thing that's important here is, so we're now talking, men who were born in China who are fighting in the United States forces, and so that was part of that evolution of the Chinese and Chinese America. This photo, this screenshot of a draft card, I think is really important. So the son of Quan Main, his name is King Quan, filled out this draft card, and there's no evidence that he actually served. What I find is really interesting is that you can see here that he was born in China. He lists, however, his country as citizen as USA. Now, I don't really actually know the truth, but according to this era, then this would have been in the 1930s, I believe, that as somebody not born in the United States, but of Chinese descent, the Exclusion Act and other immigration legislation would have forbid him from being a citizen of the United States. So here he is, he's living in the United States, he graduates from the San Diego High School and goes, going to school here, yet he's trying to be a good American citizen. So I think there's actually an interesting story behind him as well. So during World War II, Chinatown, Japanese Nihonmachi, they were in the same area. The Japanese were all ordered out of the West Coast and sent to internment camps. So the Chinese were forced to wear I am Chinese buttons. And so, out of the war effort, I found that statistic, about 20% of the Chinese males served in the military. And so it was really a great opportunity for the Chinese to prove themselves. So as part of the evolution of perceptions towards the Chinese, there were strong connections with Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party. And then his wife, Mei Ling Soon, was a great ambassador. She was educated here in the United States at Wellesley. She was Christian. So she was a wonderful example of this is what, you know, a good Chinese or a good Oriental looks like. Even to the point of, you can see Time named him Man and Wife of the Year in 1938. And then, so there's the note about the Exclusion Act. So I'm kind of moving now quickly because the focus of this talk is about San Diego's Chinatown. And following World War II, and I gave the example of the redlining, many of those barriers fell. So the Chinese Community Church was able to move out of Chinatown. And so they moved over to 43rd Street. I want to, you know, say that the Cold War was also a part of the United States. So, you know, the U.S. wanted to still be, you know, friends following World War II. So it was very much trying to support China. China had its own, you know, problems because there was then a massive civil war between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalists in 1949. So then the Nationalist Party retreated to Taiwan. So that's always part of the San Diego, you know, Chinese community environment. I remember, you know, 25 years ago, you know, at the Chinese Historical Museum when I worked with founding executive director, Dr. Alex Chuang, you know, he would say, all right, we're a Chinese historical museum, we need to be politically neutral. So he would either invite consulate representatives from both organizations or neither, and he was constantly having to navigate that. During this time period, you know, I remember, you know, years ago there was the statement, you know, there are children starving in China. So we don't hear that too much now, but in this time period, you know, in the there were famines that were taking place in China. So that meant there was a lot of you know, aid, and the United States had a lot of sympathy towards the Chinese. So I'm going to jump over kind of quickly to this point here. So 1965 was really a pivotal time, and it affects San Diego. So the immigration law abolished those low national origins, and then it emphasized professional skills and education. So United States having the best education system at the time, then this is where, you know, the Chinese, I'll focus on the Chinese, but you know, it impacted a lot of other, you know, countries, came to the United States. From Taiwan, San Diego has maybe a higher percentage of Taiwan Chinese because of the United States' close relationship with Taiwan. A lot of you know, the professionals then came here to go to school, stayed here, and were part of, you know, the emphasis to make the professional skills an important part of immigration law. The other impact was then family reunification. You know, so then once families were here, they could reunify their families, and so that actually ended up being an unintended shift in American immigration law, because they did not anticipate so many you know, new Americans coming from Asia, but that's ended up, you know, really what ended up happening. So you could see here I have some statistics. The growth from 1960 to 2010 of Chinese across the nation, you know, was dramatic, and still the majority are born abroad and are U.S. citizens. Now I want to make just a kind of a quick little, you know, detour in terms of the Convoy District. I've always been intrigued at, you know, how did the Convoy District become basically San Diego's Little Asia? And so, you know, I believe that there were Japanese companies that were operating in Kearny Mesa area, such as Kyocera. Wuchi-Chang opened up one of their stores in Kearny Mesa, and that turned out to be, you know, a good central location. Nijia Market is a Japanese chain that actually had its first store here in San Diego, and they opened in 1986. So between those two, that was where the foundation of the Convoy District and all the different Asian restaurants, they formed around that little tiny seed of Wuchi-Chang. So here is a little bit about what's happening here in San Diego. I will point out that, so where the Asian Americans are currently living are the darker purples. Camp Pendleton is kind of a different situation. But you can see here that the Penasquitas Carmel Valley area is highly populated with Asian Americans. Many down in southern part of San Diego in Chula Vista. And so you can see here pockets in Oceanside. There's a big, you know, Pacific Islander population. And so let me go to the next slide. So this was a study done in 2015. And it talks about Asian Americans as a whole. So you can see here that we have 407,000 Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. So that's what NHPI stands for. They are broken out separately. And so, but we can see here that 13% of the county population is Asian American. So in terms of cities, you can see here that Asian American, so the growth is actually pretty high, and the percentage, so in the city of San Diego, Asian Americans actually comprise a pretty high percentage at 18%. You can see here in National City, large component is a Filipino. So let me go down to the next slide. So here's actually where the countries of origin, or the, so you can see the Filipino population is actually the largest Asian American population in San Diego at 182. Chinese at 58,000, and you can see here that Taiwanese in the census is broken out separately. So that's about in the mid 60,000. Vietnamese, whole nother story about the Vietnamese and the refugee and American involvement in Vietnam. The Japanese is then a smaller population. And then we have a lot of fabulous, you know, Korean restaurants in the Asia district in Convoy. So they're represented here. And then Indian is another, you know, country of heritage at 27,000. And interestingly enough, nowadays, just to let you know, a lot of Indian refer to themselves as Desi, D-E-S-I. And that's a term of people of Indian, Pakistani descent who are living abroad. And so this is a term that you will hear more and more about, you know, Desi. So many organizations like Faculty Staff Association at Cal State San Marcos, where I'm deeply involved with, the name of our organization is APIDA, which stands for Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, and then Faculty Staff Association. So this group here, Guamanian, so you're from Guam, but the people are actually called Chamorro. So there's actually a large Chamorro population here in San Diego. So I'm going to switch over to the walking district tour. You know, this URL will be available, but I encourage you to take this. So let me switch over. I do want to highlight this QR code. If you were actually walking around on the street, I hope that this QR code will be available, and you can take this web walking tour while walking around the street. And I think it was part of my master's program, and I've donated it to the Chinese Historical Museum, and I hope that it's useful. So I will give you a quick demonstration. All right. So can somebody confirm that you're seeing the Asian Pacific Historic District walking tour?
Yep, can see it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yes.
You can see here that, well, we're basically at a planned district by the city of San Diego that helps remember old Chinatown, the Japanese Nihon Machi, the Filipino quarter. And so if you're using this on your computer, you basically scroll on down. And if you're on a smartphone, you just basically use your finger to scroll up. You can see here that the tour would start in front of the Chinese Historical Museum. Here's 3rd Avenue, so I'm moving the mouse, and J. Tour start is a red dot number 1. And so I'm not going to go through all the text, but you can use this, you can take this tour from your home on your own. So I'm going to scroll down. It talks then about the Chinese fishing, which I spoke about. You can see here that the map moves so that it's just about, you know, where Harbor Drive is right now. And that's where the Chinese fishing villages were. And so now we get to the CCPA building, and so you've seen this photo. There's a bit more information. The map then reorients itself so that you're now walking down 3rd Avenue. So I'm moving the mouse and I'm saying, okay, you're walking down 3rd Avenue, heading north. You can read, it's a Satchel and Leisure. This is an old map. So there was the Joss House, which is basically a temple, Chinese dwellings and stores all through here. This is 3rd Avenue, Chinese Wash, and then here's the Aquin building. This building still exists, so this is a very important San Diego historical marker where Aquin ran his produce business. So we're heading up north, the Wu Chi Chong. Here's an example of their ad. So we're walking up 3rd Avenue. So this here is then, you know, Chinatown, different photo. You can still hear 1912, very wooden buildings. Here in the back is the Chikon Tong building that we saw pictures of. So you can see it. And so the Chinese Museum, if you're following the mouse, is just at the far end here. So we're at actually 3rd and Island. Here's another Chinese organization, the Ying'an Association. They're still one of the associations that have a presence in downtown San Diego. And then this building is actually, I think, fascinating because it combines both the Chinese community as well as the African American community. So this building on 3rd Avenue was also known as the Ideal Hotel. So in the early 1900s, you still think and are aware of segregation. Black travelers would not be able to stay at white hotels. So this Ideal Hotel was catered to them. In the bottom floor, there was a business called the Harlem Locker Club. So if you were a black sailor, you needed to have a place to store your civilian clothes. And so this is a place that they could go. So this is still segregated San Diego, and it was a place where the Chinese and African Americans, you know, coexisted. I find this particularly interesting because this area was also known as Harlem of the West. So the black community had hotels and entertainment spaces. One was the Creole Palace. So if you go down onto Market Street at 2nd Avenue, there's a brass marker that says the Creole Palace was an entertainment space. You know, Duke Ellington, Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald all performed there. And so this is part of the mixture of people of color living in the same general area. You're hearing the term now quite a bit more, BIPOC, or B, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And so that term has really recently become a lot more familiar. But this is an example in the 1930s of those communities coexisting. So here's a bit about the district history. Chinatown, the master plan had the Chinese Museum in this location at 3rd and Island, if you're following the mouse. There's actually a Filipino organization that had for many years a museum along 5th Avenue. And so originally there was going to be an Asian gate on Market Street at 3rd, if you're following the mouse at the top. And unfortunately, there was a budget crisis, and so the plans for the Asian gate fell by the wayside. So, but thankfully, at least the city has recognized this is important historical part of San Diego. So I am going to, you've seen many of these slides. So you can see along the right-hand side, the map is kind of following where you would walk. We're now at the Horton Grand Hotel. I'm going to skip over that. The Horton Davis House. This is the important Gaslamp Quarter Historical Foundation. So if you want to know the history of San Diego and the Gaslamp Quarter, fabulous organization, and they have their museum here at this house. I want to make sure that I covered the two overlapping areas. So this is where the Nihon Machi is, the Japantown. 5th and Island was then the home for many of the Japanese organizations. Let's see. I will say, note this sign here that says the Callan Hotel. Let's see. Does it show up? Oh, well, you know what? I'm going to, oh, here we are. So if you are actually down on the street, you can see here, this is the only remaining characters of Japanese in San Diego. This stands for the Pacific Hotel in Japanese characters. You might remember, we talked about the Nanking Cafe. So this was the spot for the Nanking Cafe. And it had an Asian restaurant here operating for, many years. It recently, unfortunately, closed. There was a Japanese tofu shop right over here. And so this was where the Japanese were until the internment. 120,000 people of Japanese descent were ordered to move out to the West. And 2/3 of them were American citizens. So that's a whole nother story. I want to highlight then the Filipino community was down here, Manila Cafe, and there's stories here. This is the Philippine Library and Museum. So you can see here the map. This is basically a walk of about 10 blocks. So you could probably enjoy that. And then I wanted to highlight within the Filipino community. So this was a place where Filipino workers could go to for entertainment. And dance halls was a very popular aspect of that. So there was this challenge among the San Diego government that they didn't particularly like these dance halls. They did not like that Filipino men were dancing with white women because that was actually a job. They would hire white women. It was not sexual, but it was part of the entertainment, and they would pay 10 cents a dance. Filipinos would take taxis to these dance halls. And so this was along about 5th Avenue and Market and 6th. And then Quan Main is also on 5th Avenue, a little bit further up. So here is a combination of the Japanese and Chinese. So this restaurant is still existing. It's called Funky's Garcia. Thankfully, it's protected as a historical building. So it's the Sun Cafe, run by a Japanese family, the Obayashis. They had to give it up during the internment, but then they were able to, another family took it over. So the Obayashis ended up opening up a different restaurant. But interestingly enough, this Mexican bar, keeps the Sun Cafe example up by naming themselves Funky Garcia's at Sun Cafe. So with that, I think I'm going to close, and here is the closing thing. So here's my information. I'm available through the museum, or you can contact me at that email address. And I'm available, so I'm going to take it off presentation.